Daniel and Marissa Cole were both 27 when they stood in front of their closest friends and family and said their vows. By all accounts, they were the kind of couple people described as meant for each other. They met in college, dated for nearly a decade, and their wedding in the spring of 2017 was a celebration that felt like the natural continuation of a love story everyone believed would last forever. Guests remembered how they barely left each other's side that night, whispering inside jokes and smiling in ways that made it seem as though the rest of the world had momentarily disappeared. When the reception ended and the sparklers died down, the couple looked forward not just to marriage but to the trip they had carefully planned for months, a honeymoon on the coast. They chose a seaside town known for its history and its old-world charm. Tourists flocked there each summer for the sweeping cliffs, the harbor filled with fishing boats and the quiet beaches that looked almost untouched by time. Daniel and Marissa wanted something different than a commercial resort. They wanted history, atmosphere, and a sense of escape from the familiar. So they booked a week-long stay at a hotel that had once been the crown jewel of the town, a sprawling historic property perched on the edge of the coastline. The building had been renovated enough to remain operational, but retained a maze-like design of long hallways, staircases that led to forgotten corners, and service corridors left over from another century. Friends recalled how excited the couple had been before they left. Marissa posted a final photo on her social media the morning after the wedding, captioning it with a simple line, "Honeymoon begins." The image showed her in the passenger seat of their rental car, smiling as Daniel drove them toward the ocean. They arrived at the hotel on a Sunday afternoon, checked into a corner room with a view of the harbor, and texted their families that evening to say they were safe, happy, and ready to start their first trip as husband and wife. Everything seemed perfect. The first day was uneventful, the kind of beginning every couple hopes for. They spent time walking the boardwalk, taking photos by the cliffs, and eating seafood at a small restaurant locals had recommended. Staff at the hotel remembered them as polite and warm, a couple that stood out because of how affectionate they were. They laughed easily, held hands constantly, and seemed almost inseparable. To the people who served them drinks or passed them in the lobby, they were simply another pair of newlyweds taking in the charm of the town. But within 48 hours of checking in, Daniel and Marissa Cole would vanish without a trace. On their second evening, according to hotel staff, the couple had made casual plans to join a walking tour of the historic district, but never showed up. Guests staying on their floor recalled hearing faint laughter in the hallway. Earlier in the night, a sound some believed belonged to the young couple, but no one could say for certain. Security footage from that evening confirmed they had left their room just after 8 p.m., both dressed casually, Daniel wearing a light jacket and Marissa carrying a small purse. The two of them entered the elevator together, smiling as the doors closed. That was the last time they were ever clearly seen. The following morning, hotel housekeeping knocked on their door to clean the room. No one answered. Their belongings were still neatly arranged, their luggage opened with clothes folded inside, passports placed carefully on the nightstand, wallets tucked into a purse. The bed was unslept in, and there were no signs of disturbance, no indication that either of them had returned after leaving the night before. What looked at first like a late start to the morning quickly became something more unsettling. By early afternoon, the hotel staff grew uneasy. The couple had not checked out, had not left a message, and had not been seen at breakfast or around the property. Calls to the room went unanswered. When staff finally entered, the sight chilled them. 2 people gone, every possession left behind. To many, it felt as though Daniel and Marissa had simply stepped into the air and disappeared. Their families, still basking in the glow of wedding memories, expected cheerful updates from the honeymoon. Instead, hours of silence stretched into worry. Messages went unread, calls went straight to voicemail. It wasn't like either of them, friends later insisted. They were reliable, considerate, and deeply close to their families. That silence marked the first crack in what would become an ever-deepening mystery. The town was small enough that news of their disappearance spread quickly. Locals began to talk. Some wondered if the couple had been swept off the cliffs during a nighttime walk. Others whispered about the dangerous currents near the harbor. but the details didn't align. Their shoes, jackets, and belongings remained in the hotel. Theories about robbery didn't make sense either. Nothing was missing, not money, not identification, not even jewelry. What began as a delayed honeymoon update turned into unanswered questions that alarmed everyone connected to them. They had vanished in a place meant for joy, inside a building that should have been safe, in a town that rarely saw violent crime. And as hours turned to the next day, the sense of dread deepened. The honeymoon that was supposed to mark the beginning of their life together instead ended in silence, leaving behind a room frozen in time. That silence was about to ignite a desperate search, one that would uncover far more questions than answers. By the third day of their stay, the absence of Daniel and Marissa Cole could no longer be dismissed as a case of late sleeping or spontaneous adventure. They had booked a scenic boat tour along the coastline that morning, a reservation confirmed by staff who had expected them to join the group. When they failed to appear, the tour company assumed at first that the couple had simply changed their plans. But when the evening came and the two did not return to the hotel, unease began to spread. Housekeeping, returning for the second day in a row, found the same sight as before. Luggage perfectly in place, passports and wallets untouched, clothing folded, the bed unslept in. There was no note, no half-packed bag, nothing to suggest they had intended to leave for any length of time. Hotel management, growing increasingly concerned, checked the security system for answers. The footage showed the couple leaving their floor just after 8 p.m. the night before. They appeared relaxed, chatting quietly as they stepped into the elevator. From there, the cameras tracked them through the lobby as they exited the main doors and walked toward the street. But after that, there was nothing. The camera outside the front entrance caught them briefly heading in the direction of the boardwalk. Then, they passed out of view. No footage ever showed them returning. Every other camera in the building remained blank of their presence, as though they had simply walked away from their honeymoon and vanished into the night. By the time the hotel staff contacted the police, nearly 24 hours had passed since the couple was last seen. Officers arrived and began with the basics, checking the room, interviewing staff, and contacting local businesses. What they found deepened the mystery. The room showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. The couple's phones, still plugged into their chargers, had not been touched since the previous night. Their wallets contained cash, cards, and identification. The items that usually disappear in cases of theft or robbery were all accounted for. The scene suggested not two people who had decided to run away, but two people who had stepped out expecting to return. The first hours of the search focused on the obvious dangers of the coastal town. Police and volunteers scoured the beaches, cliffs, and harbor with flashlights and search dogs. They questioned fishermen at the docks and combed the tide pools for any sign of disturbance. If the couple had taken a walk along the cliffs after dark, perhaps to see the ocean at night, an accident seemed possible. The cliffs were steep and unstable in certain areas, and one misstep could have sent them plunging into the water below. But despite extensive searching, there was nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no broken fences or disturbed brush. The ocean itself was considered, but the theory didn't hold under scrutiny. Tides and currents along that stretch of coast were known to return bodies to shore within days. Local authorities and Coast Guard units explained that drownings in the region rarely ended without remains being recovered, yet days turned into weeks with no discovery. Boats searched the water, helicopters scanned from above, divers explored near the rocks and pilings. Each effort ended with the same result: silence. Investigators turned to the town itself. Officers canvassed shops, restaurants, and the boardwalk, asking locals if anyone remembered seeing the young couple after they left the hotel. A few people claimed to have spotted them around dinner time, but none of the accounts matched in detail. One shopkeeper said he believed he saw a woman fitting Marissa's description near a souvenir stand, while a diner insisted they had seen Daniel at a corner cafe. But the times conflicted, and no surveillance footage corroborated either story. In a town that saw a steady stream of tourists, it was easy for faces and memories to blur. As the search expanded, tension grew. For the families back home, the updates were devastating. They had expected stories of sightseeing, photos, and laughter, not news of an active police investigation. Calls to Daniel and Marissa's phones went unanswered. Texts remained unread. By now, the couple had missed multiple check-ins with loved ones, something that family members described as completely out of character. They were dependable, thoughtful, and especially close to their parents and siblings. For them to stay silent was a sign that something had gone very wrong. Theories began to take shape among investigators. The leading idea was that they had wandered near the cliffs and been swept into the ocean, an explanation that could account for their sudden disappearance. But there were holes in that narrative. Why had both of them gone missing together? Why had no trace been found? And if it was an accident, why did it look as though they had left their hotel room planning to return? As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere shifted from anxious searching to grim realization. Flyers with their faces appeared across the town, on storefronts and bus stops, and search parties dwindled as hope of finding them alive grew thin. Yet the lack of evidence made the case unusual, even for seasoned investigators. There were no bodies, no signs of foul play, no solid sightings, no trail to follow. The disappearance of Daniel and Marissa Cole became less of a case of missing tourists and more of a baffling mystery, one that locals and authorities alike could not explain. With the beaches, cliffs, and harbor yielding no answers, investigators would soon be forced to look elsewhere for clues, shifting the focus from natural accidents to the unsettling possibility that something far darker had taken place within the walls of the hotel itself. Within days of the couple's disappearance, both of their families boarded flights to the coastal town, arriving with the expectation that they would be walking into a situation already under control. What they found instead was a case stalled almost from the start. Police had searched the beaches and the harbor, but uncovered nothing. Hotel staff had turned over security footage, yet it offered no answers beyond showing Daniel and Marissa leaving the elevator together that night. Their belongings still sat untouched in the hotel room, as if waiting for their owners to return. To the families, it was unthinkable. Daniel's mother would later say that when she entered the room for the first time, she felt like she had stepped into a paused moment in time, one that should have been temporary but never resumed. They began demanding answers immediately. Detectives arranged interviews with the staff, guests, and nearby businesses, but what came back only deepened the confusion. A bartender swore he remembered seeing the couple having drinks in the lounge the night they vanished. A tourist insisted he saw them leaving the property and heading toward a side alley leading to the harbor. A housekeeper told investigators she was certain she saw Marissa walking quickly down a service hallway not meant for guests. Each account conflicted with the other, and none were backed by footage or physical evidence. The more stories piled up, the less sense any of it made. This uncertainty quickly put strain on the relationship between the families and investigators. Police urged patience, explaining that conflicting eyewitness reports were common in missing persons cases. But for parents and siblings desperate to find their loved ones, the explanations sounded like excuses. Every day that passed without progress felt like a day lost forever. The families began printing and distributing flyers themselves, walking the boardwalk and the narrow streets of the town, handing out photographs of the smiling newlyweds taken just days before. Some locals offered sympathy and joined search groups, while others whispered rumors of their own, stories of tourists who had vanished in the past, of criminal networks that preyed on visitors, of the hotel's own murky history. As national media outlets caught wind of the story, the quiet seaside town became flooded with reporters. News vans lined the main street, journalists crowded the hotel lobby, and cameras were trained on every move the families made. What had begun as a private tragedy was now playing out under a glaring public spotlight. Interviewers asked grieving parents how they felt, speculated on live television about whether Daniel and Marissa had run away together, and dissected every known detail of the case. For the families, the attention was overwhelming. They welcomed the exposure, believing it might bring answers, but the invasive questions and sensational headlines only added to their anguish. The tension between the relatives and the investigators escalated as the weeks dragged on. Daniel's father accused the police of not treating the case with enough urgency. Marissa's sister openly criticized the hotel staff for withholding information, insisting that someone there must know more than they were saying. Press conferences became heated with reporters, asking if foul play was being ignored to protect the town's reputation as a tourist destination. Detectives denied it, but even locals began to whisper about pressure from business owners to avoid tarnishing the area's image. The families stayed at the hotel for weeks, turning the property into both a base of operations and a constant reminder of their loss. They scoured the town themselves, retracing the couple's last known steps, pressing anyone who might have seen them. They organized candlelight vigils near the harbor, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Each night, they returned to the same building where Daniel and Marissa had last been seen, haunted by the fact that the room remained as untouched as the day they had left it. As time stretched on, grief turned sharper, mixing with suspicion. The idea of a simple accident no longer satisfied anyone. If they had slipped into the sea, why had nothing washed ashore? If they had fallen from the cliffs, why was there no evidence? Theories shifted toward the possibility of foul play. Rumors spread that criminal groups operated in the shadows of the tourist town, targeting vulnerable travelers. Some speculated about trafficking, others about robbery gone wrong. Anonymous tips began to pour in, each one more sensational than the last, but all led to dead ends. The families clung to each new rumor, desperate for direction, only to be devastated again when it unraveled. The atmosphere around the case grew heavier, tinged with frustration and anger. The once bright, joyful narrative of a honeymoon had turned into something darker, a story of negligence, distrust, and unanswered questions. The families refused to leave, determined to stay until something broke. They walked the streets with eyes searching every face, convinced that somewhere in that town lay the key to understanding what had happened. Yet each night ended the same, with silence, with an empty hotel room, with no sign of Daniel and Marissa. What had started as a search for two missing newlyweds was quickly transforming into a national mystery, one where grief-fueled obsession and suspicion began pointing not just outward but directly at the place where the couple had been last seen alive. The investigation into Daniel and Marissa Cole's disappearance shifted from the shoreline and harbor back to the place where they had last been seen, the hotel itself. Detectives began the painstaking task of scouring every corner of the sprawling building, starting with the room the couple had occupied. Crime scene technicians dusted for fingerprints and swabbed for DNA, though nothing unusual surfaced. The room remained undisturbed, as if preserved in time. The bedding was untouched, their luggage still neatly packed, valuables sitting openly in plain view. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no indication of a hasty departure. To the investigators, it was chilling. This was not the room of a couple who had run away. This was the room of two people who had intended to return but never did. Attention turned quickly to the surveillance system. Detectives collected every available tape from the hotel's cameras, hoping for clarity. What they found only frustrated them further. While cameras showed Daniel and Marissa stepping into the elevator and exiting into the lobby, no footage captured them leaving the property after that. Several cameras had malfunctioned that night, leaving wide gaps in coverage, particularly in the basement, the service corridors, and older wings of the hotel that had not been renovated in decades. Even the exterior cameras offered little. One caught them walking briefly toward the street before they disappeared out of frame. After that, it was as though the couple had stepped into a void. When questioned, employees insisted they had no knowledge of what happened. Some recalled seeing the couple smiling and holding hands earlier in the evening. Others admitted the hotel's layout was confusing even to staff. There were rumors of service tunnels built beneath the property decades earlier, meant for deliveries and maintenance, now sealed or left to decay. These areas were poorly lit, rarely inspected, and not covered by surveillance. Detectives toured the tunnels with flashlights, navigating damp concrete passageways that smelled of mildew. They found broken pipes, locked doors leading to storage, and corners where the walls had been patched in ways that suggested sections had once extended farther. Yet there was nothing that connected directly to the missing couple. Theories began to multiply. Some investigators suspected a robbery gone wrong. Perhaps the couple had been lured into a side corridor and confronted, but the theory unraveled quickly. None of their valuables were missing. Others floated the possibility of a targeted kidnapping. Yet kidnappings typically came with demands, and no ransom calls ever came. The families waited by their phones day and night, but no one reached out. Without communication, the idea of kidnapping seemed unlikely. The longer detectives searched, the more strained the investigation became. Each dead end carried weight, and privately, several admitted that they were grasping at straws. They interviewed nearly every guest who had stayed at the hotel during that week, but testimonies contradicted one another. Some insisted they saw the couple later that evening, while others swore they never returned after leaving for dinner. Hotel staff gave conflicting accounts about which areas of the property were accessible to guests. The confusion only added to the frustration. In an effort to leave no stone unturned, detectives coordinated with outside agencies. Search dogs were brought in to comb through the grounds and nearby streets. Cadaver dogs were taken into the tunnels and even along the cliffs, but they alerted to nothing significant. Dive teams searched the harbor again, though then weeks had passed and hopes of recovering evidence from the water were slim. The absence of any trace weighed heavily on the investigation. In missing persons cases, even the smallest clue, a piece of clothing, a dropped phone, a footprint, can give direction. Here, there was simply nothing. The mounting pressure from the families and the national media intensified scrutiny on the hotel. Reporters described it as a relic of another era, with dark hallways and forgotten corners that seemed like they could swallow people whole. The owners faced accusations of negligence, with some suggesting they had ignored safety and security issues for years. Amid the storm of attention, the hotel was forced to shut down temporarily. Reservations were canceled, employees laid off, and its reputation suffered a blow it would never fully recover from. What had once been marketed as a romantic seaside getaway was now known as the place where two newlyweds had vanished. Behind closed doors, investigators admitted what they feared most. The case was slipping away. Leads had dried up, theories contradicted one another, and there was no physical evidence to move the investigation forward. They had exhausted searches of the coastline, interviewed everyone with even the most tenuous connection, and explored every corner of the building. Yet, 8 months after Daniel and Marissa disappeared, the investigation yielded nothing that explained where they had gone or what had happened to them. Publicly, the police insisted the case remained active, but in private, files began to pile up unanswered. Detectives rotated off the case, new ones came in, and fresh eyes reviewed the evidence, only to arrive at the same grim conclusion. Without a breakthrough, this case was on its way to becoming cold. For the families, it was a nightmare they couldn't wake from, watching momentum fade while knowing their loved ones had vanished inside a place that still stood, silent and indifferent, holding its secrets. As the months slipped into years, the disappearance of Daniel and Marissa Cole began to take on a life of its own. With no resolution from law enforcement and no new evidence surfacing, speculation filled the vacuum. It started small, with locals in the seaside town debating in hushed tones at cafes and markets. But soon, the theories spread nationally, then globally, fueled by true crime television segments and the growing reach of online forums. What had begun as a straightforward missing persons case had evolved into a mystery that seemed to invite endless interpretation, each theory more desperate or dramatic than the last. One of the earliest suggestions was that the couple had staged their own disappearance. Some argued they had carefully planned to vanish and start a new life elsewhere. Commentators pointed to their untouched valuables in the hotel room as proof. They didn't need them if they had already arranged new identities. This theory was painful for their families, who knew Daniel and Marissa as grounded, responsible, and deeply connected to their loved ones. Their parents flatly rejected the idea, pointing out that both had thriving careers and no history of instability. Friends emphasized that the couple had been in the prime of their lives, celebrating a marriage they had looked forward to for years. And yet, despite these objections, the theory persisted in certain corners of the media, whispered as if it explained the unexplainable. Another, darker possibility gained traction, that they had been victims of organized crime or a trafficking network. The seaside town was popular with tourists, but its remote position along the coast and its proximity to shipping routes had long fed rumors of illicit activity operating just beneath the surface. Online sleuths claimed the couple may have been targeted for abduction, lured into service corridors of the hotel, and moved out of the building unnoticed through staff entrances that lacked surveillance. This idea frightened the families most of all because it suggested deliberate human cruelty rather than accident or chance. For many, it was easier to imagine a shadowy network than to accept that two people could vanish so completely without a trace. The grainy final image of the couple stepping off the elevator became the focus of obsessive analysis. Online communities froze the frame, zoomed in, and speculated endlessly. Was there a shadow in the corner of the hallway? Was Marissa's smile forced? Was Daniel glancing at something just out of view? Every pixel was treated as potential evidence, but none of it ever produced concrete answers. The footage became more of a haunting symbol than an investigative tool, a reminder of the last time they were known to be alive. Investigators, meanwhile, continued to chase leads, but each one collapsed under scrutiny. Anonymous letters arrived claiming to know the couple's fate, only to be traced back to hoaxers seeking attention. Psychics and fortune-tellers offered their services, leading searches into forests, abandoned warehouses, even graveyards. But none of their claims materialized into evidence. A few alleged sightings surfaced over the years, one in a diner in another state, another at a border crossing. But when checked against records and surveillance, none matched Daniel or Marissa. The trail remained stubbornly cold. The lack of progress weighed heavily on the families. They held tightly to hope, but that hope was forced to bend under the pressure of silence. Each year on the anniversary of the couple's disappearance, their parents organized public vigils. Candles were lit, photographs displayed, and prayers whispered into the night air. Relatives gave interviews to keep the story alive, repeating the same desperate message that someone, somewhere, must know something. But as each year passed, the vigils grew smaller, the media attention waned, and the once bright faces on the Saditao missing posters faded into the background of other tragedies. Grief transformed into something harsher, an obsession with the unknown. Marissa's mother refused to remove her daughter's belongings from her childhood bedroom, while Daniel's father kept a binder filled with clippings, timelines, and theories he pieced together himself. They followed up on rumors personally, calling strangers, driving to towns where tips had surfaced, and sitting across from people who swore they knew what happened. Each time they returned home empty-handed. Each false lead deepened their wounds. The community of online investigators, however, refused to let the case die. Entire forums dedicated themselves to dissecting every known fact, piecing together maps of the hotel, theorizing about maintenance shafts and hidden doors, and even contacting retired police officers who had once worked the case. Some believed the truth was buried in bureaucratic incompetence. Others claimed there had been a deliberate cover-up to protect the hotel's reputation. Theories spiraled into conspiracy, but they also kept the story alive long after the headlines faded. For law enforcement, the case had entered the territory no investigator wants to face: a cold file. Without new evidence, without bodies, without witnesses willing to come forward, their options had run out. Detectives rotated off the case, newer officers inherited it, and then passed it along again. All the while, the families were left in the same place, suspended between hope and despair, clinging to rituals of remembrance even as answers grew increasingly unlikely. Years after Daniel and Marissa's disappearance, their names remained spoken at vigils and whispered in true crime circles. But for their loved ones, it was not a story. It was an endless waiting game, one that left them staring at the last known image of the smiling couple stepping off an elevator, asking the same haunting question over and over. How do two people simply vanish from a hotel and never come back? As the search for Daniel and Marissa Cole dragged on with no tangible progress, attention slowly shifted away from the immediate timeline of their disappearance and toward the building that had last contained them. The hotel, once praised for its romantic old-world charm, came under renewed scrutiny. Local historians, journalists, and curious investigators began peeling back layers of its past, and what they found unsettled even the most skeptical observers. The hotel had stood on the same cliffside since the early 1900s, built during a boom in seaside tourism. In its earliest decades, it was a luxury escape for wealthy travelers, complete with ornate ballrooms, secret card rooms, and a network of maintenance tunnels designed to move staff and goods discreetly through the property. Over the years, those tunnels became less necessary, portions fell into disrepair, and some were walled off during renovations. Longtime employees whispered about them, though most modern staff avoided the subject entirely. When asked directly by investigators, a few admitted that there were parts of the basement and old service wings they had never entered in all their years working there. Digging into public records and old newspapers revealed that Daniel and Marissa were not the first guests to vanish under mysterious circumstances. In the 1950s, a businessman from Chicago staying at the hotel never checked out. His luggage was found in his room, much like the Coles, but no sign of him ever surfaced. A decade later, a young woman traveling alone was reported missing after her family failed to hear from her. Hotel records confirmed her stay, but her name disappeared from the guest ledger halfway through the week, and no one could explain why. Each of these cases faded into obscurity, dismissed as unfortunate accidents or people who chose to disappear. But with the Coles case still unresolved, these old stories took on new weight. By the 1970s, the hotel had developed a reputation in town as a place of secrets. Renovations during that decade uncovered a bricked-up stairwell behind a storage closet, its steps leading nowhere. Another project revealed a small hidden room, windowless and unfinished, thought to have been part of the old service network. Contractors speculated it had once been used during Prohibition, when smuggling liquor through the tunnels was common. Locals traded ghost stories about these discoveries, describing the building as a place that could swallow people whole. Yet over time, the stories became less about fact and more about folklore, filed away as eerie coincidences until the Coles brought them back into sharp focus. When journalists began reporting on these older cases, the parallels were difficult to ignore. Guests disappearing without evidence, luggage left untouched, records incomplete or inconsistent. It was as if the hotel itself had absorbed them. The press ran with the angle, dubbing it the Vanishing Hotel, and even investigators privately admitted that the similarities between past and present cases were unsettling. Still, without physical evidence linking the earlier disappearances to the Newlyweds, the connection remained speculative. Rumors about hidden passageways circulated widely. Some former employees insisted there were still doors that led into narrow service shafts, sometimes disguised behind mirrors or panels. Others swore that certain parts of the basement had been sealed hastily, as if management wanted to bury parts of the building rather than repair them. Investigators explored the property extensively, knocking on walls, mapping out known blueprints, and comparing them with renovations. The problem was that the hotel had been rebuilt, expanded, and patched up so many times that no single blueprint was complete. Dead ends appeared where hallways once existed, staircases led to walls, and doors opened into unfinished spaces. Forensic teams used ground-penetrating radar in the basement, detecting voids behind certain walls. But these anomalies were dismissed as structural gaps. Renovation crews from earlier decades confirmed that it was common to wall off unusable areas rather than demolish them fully. Whether any of these voids were connected to missing guests, however, remained unanswered. Locals who had grown up in the town began sharing long-forgotten stories with reporters. One elderly resident recalled hearing as a child that people go missing in that place and nobody asks questions. Another spoke of staff members who suddenly left without notice, only to be quietly replaced. Although anecdotal, the accounts painted the hotel as a place where secrets could thrive unchecked. The owners of the hotel fiercely defended its reputation, dismissing the stories as urban legend fueled by sensationalist media. They argued that a building of its age would naturally carry myths, especially one with such a storied past. Yet behind closed doors, even employees admitted discomfort. Some avoided certain hallways late at night, describing an oppressive feeling in the walled-off sections. Others confessed that when Daniel and Marissa vanished, they immediately thought of the older cases, wondering if the building had once again claimed its victims. For the families of the missing couple, hearing about the hotel's history was unbearable. It suggested that their loved ones were not the victims of random chance, but of a pattern stretching back decades. They pressed investigators to reopen old files, to cross-reference every detail with the Coles disappearance. Detectives did so, but the records were patchy, many incomplete or missing entirely. Whether through negligence, poor record-keeping, or deliberate omission, the trail was difficult to follow. In the end, the history of the hotel provided more shadows than clarity. It gave shape to rumors and supplied fertile ground for speculation, but it offered no proof. Still, the echoes of past vanishings and the discovery of walled-off spaces lingered heavily in the minds of investigators. Even without definitive evidence, the parallels were enough to make many quietly suspect that the walls of the hotel were keeping secrets no one had yet managed to uncover. In the years following the disappearance of Daniel and Marissa Cole, the once relentless investigation slowed to a near standstill. Detectives rotated off the case, the family's calls for renewed searches were met with bureaucratic responses, and the media slowly moved on to fresher tragedies. What had begun as a national obsession became another cold file buried in the archives of unsolved mysteries. Each year that passed without progress deepened the divide between the two families. Daniel's parents, emotionally exhausted and financially strained by years of travel, private investigators, and fruitless searches, eventually made the heartbreaking decision to file for legal death declarations. They believed it was the only way to secure closure, however hollow it might feel. Marissa's family, on the other hand, refused to take such a step. To them, acknowledging legal death meant admitting defeat, and as long as no bodies had been recovered, there was always a chance, however slim, that she was alive somewhere. The hotel where the couple had last been seen underwent its own transformation. The owners sold the property to new management just 3 years after the disappearance, desperate to rid themselves of the reputation that clung to the building. The new owners rebranded, repainting walls, installing modern furniture, and marketing it under a new name. For most visitors, it was just another picturesque seaside destination, its shadowed history hidden behind glossy brochures and smiling staff. Guests checked in and out, took photos of the ocean view, and left with no knowledge that two people had once vanished within its walls. Only the locals and the families who still visited annually kept the memory alive. Each anniversary, vigils were held outside the hotel. Candles flickered along the boardwalk, and photographs of the missing couple were propped against the railing that overlooked the harbor. The crowds dwindled over the years, from hundreds in the first to dozens in the fifth, to only a small circle of relatives and devoted friends by the eighth. Media crews stopped attending, and reporters no longer called for statements. For Daniel and Marissa's families, the vigils became less about keeping the story alive in public memory, and more about holding on to their own fragile hope. Meanwhile, the town tried to move forward. Businesses didn't want the disappearance attached to their identity. New tourists came, unaware of the unresolved tragedy, walking the same streets and staying in the same hotel where the Coles had last been seen. Locals noticed the irony, but said nothing. For them, the story had become like a ghost in the background, always present, never acknowledged. For investigators, the absence of evidence left the case stagnant. Every few years, a new detective would review the file, scan through the incomplete reports, and end up in the same place as those before them. Without witnesses, without physical traces, and without new leads, there was nowhere to go. The case file remained thick but lifeless, each page a reminder of what hadn't been found. Privately, Some officers admitted they believed the couple's remains would never be recovered, but time has a way of shifting circumstances in unexpected ways. Nearly 8 years after the disappearance, the hotel underwent yet another renovation. This time, it was more extensive. A wing of the building that had remained closed since the 1980s was finally slated for modernization. Construction crews were brought in to tear down old walls, replace pipes, and clear out storage areas that had been neglected for decades. For most of the crew, it was just another job, dusty, tedious work in a building with too many quirks. One morning, workers began removing drywall from a narrow corridor in the disused section. Behind it, they discovered something strange, a bricked-over opening hidden behind layers of plaster. At first, they assumed it was part of the building's odd patchwork history, but when they broke through, the opening led to a narrow shaft that appeared to have been sealed deliberately. The air inside was stale, untouched for years. When their flashlights illuminated the space, several workers stepped back in shock. What they saw was not an empty void, but the unmistakable outline of human remains. Word traveled quickly. The construction site was shut down, police were summoned, and for the first time in nearly a decade, the name of Daniel and Marissa Cole returned to the headlines. Families who had long since given up on hearing new developments were jolted back into the nightmare they had tried to navigate for years. The discovery ignited both dread and hope. Dread for what it confirmed, and hope that maybe, at last, the truth of what happened inside that hotel could be uncovered. 8 years of silence had passed with no answers, no movement, and no closure. Now, with the remains behind the wall, everything changed. What had once been a cold case was abruptly alive again, demanding answers that had been buried, quite literally, within the walls of the very place where the couple had last been seen. The silence was broken, replaced with the chilling realization that the hotel had never let go of its secrets. It had been hiding them all along. It was an ordinary morning for the renovation crew, one of many spent clearing out the forgotten wing of the seaside hotel. Dust hung in the air, the sound of hammers and drills echoing down narrow hallways that hadn't been entered in decades. Workers had grown accustomed to finding oddities behind the walls, old pipes, forgotten furniture, even sealed closets filled with rusted kitchen equipment. But what they uncovered in the spring of 2025 was unlike anything anyone expected. As demolition moved toward a section of corridor near the service hallways, a laborer's crowbar struck against something solid behind the plaster. At first, it seemed like just another patch of outdated masonry, but when the crew knocked deeper, they uncovered a bricked-up wall, different in texture and color from the surrounding structure. It was clear that this part of the passage had been sealed deliberately, its existence hidden from every modern blueprint of the building. Curiosity took over. They chipped away at the bricks until an opening revealed itself. Behind it lay a void, narrow, dark, and filled with stale, suffocating air that had not been disturbed in decades. When the first flashlight beams pierced the shaft, silence fell over the crew. They weren't looking at empty space. 2 human forms lay within, collapsed in unnatural positions, skeletal remains half covered in dust and debris. Time had reduced them to bone, but what surrounded them painted a clearer picture. Scraps of decayed fabric, a leather purse strap hardened with age, a rusted wristwatch cracked down the middle, and a thin metal band that caught the light just enough to reveal what it once was: a wedding ring. The workers staggered back in disbelief, some refusing to look again. A supervisor ordered the area sealed off, and within minutes, the police were called. By the time investigators arrived, the entire wing had been locked down. Detectives, forensic teams, and crime scene specialists filled the hotel, their equipment cases replacing the tools of the construction crew. Yellow tape stretched across the hallway, shutting out both staff and tourists. For the first time in years, the building's name was back in the headlines, not as a rebranded seaside escape, but as the epicenter of a chilling discovery. As investigators examined the remains, the parallels to the Cole case were undeniable. The skeletal forms appeared to belong to one male and one female, positioned in close proximity. The items found with them matched descriptions given by the families years earlier: Marissa's purse strap, Daniel's watch, the wedding ring the bride had been seen wearing on the elevator footage. Even without DNA confirmation, there was little doubt whose remains had been hidden inside that shaft. After 8 years of mystery, the couple had finally been found. The scene itself raised more questions than it answered. The shaft was narrow, no more than a few feet across, and there was no obvious entrance or exit aside from the wall that had been sealed. Forensic examiners noted that the brickwork closing it off was different from the original construction of the hotel, suggesting it had been added later, though no record existed of when or why. The question haunted investigators immediately. How had the couple ended up in there, and who had sealed them inside? The atmosphere in the hotel shifted instantly. Guests were evacuated from the wing, and whispers rippled through the lobby as word spread. Some staff, who had long heard rumors about hidden rooms and sealed passages, admitted privately that they were not surprised. Others were shaken, recalling the day years earlier when the Newlyweds had vanished without explanation. For many, it felt as though the hotel itself had finally exhaled a secret it had been holding tightly all this time. News outlets descended on the coastal town once again, broadcasting the discovery across the country. Reporters crowded the street outside the hotel, their cameras capturing the moment the remains were carried out under white sheets. Headlines declared the cold case finally solved, though investigators were careful to caution that what they had uncovered was only the beginning. Identifying the remains was one step. Determining how Daniel and Marissa had died and why they had ended up behind a bricked wall was another entirely. For the families, the call from law enforcement was devastating. They had begged for years for answers, clung to hope that their children might be alive somewhere, and struggled against silence. Now, after nearly a decade, they were given the truth no parent ever wants. Daniel's parents, who had once filed legal death declarations, wept openly when told the remains had been found. Marissa's family, who had refused to let go of hope, collapsed under the weight of confirmation. Their daughter was not coming back. Neither was Daniel. Yet even in the devastation, new questions kept them from closure. If this had been an accident, how had both of them ended up sealed in such a place? If it was deliberate, who had the time and knowledge to wall them in without detection? And why, in all the years of searching, had this passage never been uncovered until now? The discovery behind the wall reignited the case with force. Detectives reopened old files, re-examined interviews, and prepared to launch a fresh forensic analysis of the remains. What had once been a story of silence had become an active investigation again, and the chilling image of a bricked shaft holding 2 young lives lost became the focus of renewed national attention. Forensic experts moved quickly once the skeletal remains were recovered from the hidden shaft. Within days, DNA analysis provided the confirmation the families had long dreaded. The bones belonged to Daniel and Marissa Cole. The revelation should have closed the case, but instead, it unraveled a new set of mysteries. The very place they were discovered raised questions that no one could easily answer. The shaft in which they had been found was never meant to be accessed by hotel guests. According to decades-old blueprints, the corridor had been walled off during a renovation in the late 1970s. Construction records confirmed that the area was deemed unsafe and permanently sealed. For the Coles to have ended up inside in 2017 suggested something was deeply wrong. Either the shaft had been reopened at some point, or someone had deliberately placed them there. Investigators pressed architects, contractors, and longtime employees for any recollection of modifications, but no one admitted to making changes in recent decades. The condition and arrangement of the remains only deepened the mystery. Both Daniel and Marissa were found slumped near the base of the shaft, their bones intermingled in ways that suggested collapse rather than careful placement. Forensic anthropologists examined the angles and concluded that the couple had likely been alive when they entered the space, as there were no signs of post-mortem manipulation. Their clothing remnants appeared torn but not cut, as if degraded naturally over time. A purse strap, Daniel's broken watch, and Marissa's wedding ring all remained close to where the bodies had settled, undisturbed by outside tampering. Theories arose quickly. One possibility was that the couple had discovered an unlocked or concealed door while exploring the hotel. If so, they may have entered the shaft by mistake, unaware that it led nowhere and was dangerous to traverse. But that begged the question: why would such a door exist if the shaft was supposed to be sealed decades earlier? Another explanation was more sinister, that someone with knowledge of the building had forced them inside and sealed the entrance afterward. Yet investigators struggled to prove either theory. The autopsy reports offered little clarity. Though the skeletal remains were well preserved, the absence of flesh meant toxicology was impossible. No fractures were found that would indicate blunt force trauma or violence. There were no signs of defensive wounds on the bones, nothing to suggest they had been attacked physically. Equally troubling, there was no clear evidence of a fall from a height, as the bones showed no breaks consistent with impact injuries. The most likely explanation was that the Coles had succumbed to dehydration or oxygen deprivation after being trapped. But how they came to be in that position remained unanswered. The families pressed for more answers. How could two healthy adults simply wander into a sealed maintenance shaft and never come out? Why had no one heard cries for help or noticed anything unusual? Forensic acoustic specialists were even consulted to determine whether someone shouting from inside the shaft could have been heard in the hallways above. The conclusion was unsettling. Sound likely would have been muffled almost completely by the layers of brick and plaster. If Daniel and Marissa had screamed, no one outside would have ever known. Investigators revisited the old security footage from 2017, reviewing every second in light of the new discovery. The last known images still showed them stepping off the elevator together, smiling, seemingly relaxed. Nothing in their demeanor suggested fear or urgency. But after that moment, they vanished from view. There was no video evidence of them entering any service hallway, and no employee recalled seeing them in restricted areas. The lack of documentation made it impossible to determine whether they had been lured, chased, or had simply stumbled into the wrong passage. The strangeness of the shaft's history complicated matters further. Some construction workers from the 1970s admitted in interviews that ceiling projects were sometimes incomplete, done hastily to save money. A hidden door or partial opening could have remained. Others suggested that renovations over the decades might have temporarily exposed the shaft, leaving a period during which it was accessible. But no record of such work existed, and without documentation, it remained speculation. Public fascination surged again. Online forums buzzed with theories. Some insisted the couple had been victims of a staff member who knew the hotel's hidden areas. Others argued it was a tragic accident compounded by negligence, while conspiracy-minded voices suggested a deliberate cover-up by hotel management. The most chilling theory, that someone had intentionally bricked them in while they were still alive, was not dismissed outright, though investigators admitted they lacked evidence to prove it. Forensic teams continued combing through the evidence. Soil samples from the shaft walls were analyzed for traces of disturbance, but results were inconclusive. Microscopic examination of the bones revealed no chemical residues or unusual deposits. In the end, the reports concluded only what had been apparent from the start. Daniel and Marissa had died inside the shaft, with no clear cause of death and no clear explanation for how they entered. For their families, the forensic confirmation brought a cruel form of closure. They finally had their loved ones back, but the answers they received left them with even greater questions. Instead of resolving the mystery, the discovery had twisted it into something more haunting. How could two people vanish so completely inside a hotel and remain hidden for 8 years? And if the shaft had been sealed decades before, then how, in 2017, had it opened its doors to two newlyweds who would never walk out again? The discovery of Daniel and Marissa Coles remains behind the bricked-up wall gave their families what they had begged for over 8 long years. Confirmation that their loved ones had not simply run away, that their disappearance was not some cruel trick or abandonment, but instead of peace, the revelation only deepened their torment. They had bodies, yes, but not the truth. Officially, the police closed the case with the explanation that the couple had wandered into an unsafe, long-forgotten service shaft and become trapped. It was labeled a tragic accident, the kind that might happen once in a lifetime. Yet, even as those words were spoken in press conferences, inconsistencies hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. The shaft where the coals were found was not a place meant to be accessible. It was supposed to have been sealed for decades, a relic of the hotel's early construction. Investigators themselves admitted that no blueprints showed a usable entrance in 2017. How, then, could two healthy, alert adults stumble inside by mistake? And if they had, how had no one heard them, seen them, or noticed the newly bricked-over entrance in the days that followed? Hotel staff had walked those same corridors nightly. Housekeepers had passed by countless times. Management had insisted that the building was secure. Yet for nearly a decade, two bodies lay only feet away, hidden behind a wall no one thought to question. The official narrative satisfied few. Journalists who had followed the case from the beginning pointed out that the investigation had failed at multiple junctures. If cadaver dogs had been sent into the basement early on, would they have detected something? If the hotel's full blueprints had been studied more carefully, might investigators have realized that sealed spaces still existed? Critics accused authorities of rushing to label the case unsolvable years earlier, only for construction crews to stumble onto the truth by chance. For the families, it was a brutal reminder that the answers might have been found long ago, if only the right questions had been asked. The discovery reignited public fascination, and with it, a new wave of speculation. Online sleuths dissected every available photo of the shaft and remains, comparing timelines and scrutinizing the autopsy reports. Forums lit up with theories. Some argued the coals had been deliberately lured into the shaft by someone with intimate knowledge of the hotel's forgotten architecture. Others suggested they had witnessed something they weren't meant to see that night, perhaps criminal activity, and had been silenced. The most disturbing theory, one whispered not just online but among some locals, was that the couple had been alive when the bricks were laid, sealed in by human hands. No one could disprove that possibility, and that uncertainty became the most haunting part of the case. The families replayed the timeline endlessly. Daniel and Marissa left their room smiling, their belongings untouched, their phones still charging. They had planned to return. At what point did their path intersect with the door to that hidden shaft? Who might have been nearby? Could they have knocked, screamed, or clawed at the walls before their strength gave out? The absence of answers made their deaths not just tragic, but unbearably cruel. The hotel, rebranded under new management, could not escape the shadow of the discovery. Tourists returned, drawn not by charm, but by morbid curiosity. Guests whispered about the coals as they checked in, some requesting to see the wing where they had vanished. Online travel reviews mentioned the case more often than the ocean view. Locals, too, began to weave the story into the town's folklore, speaking of the coals alongside older tales of guests who had gone missing decades before. The building's age, its labyrinth of hallways, its sealed rooms, all became part of a growing legend that it was not just a hotel, but a place that swallowed people. For the families, anniversaries became even heavier. The vigils now included candles for 2 confirmed lives lost, not for 2 hopeful returns. Daniel's parents found hollow relief in having remains to bury, while Marissa's family struggled with bitterness. They had resisted declaring her dead for years, clinging to hope, only to face the cruel truth in the form of bones pulled from behind a wall. They demanded further investigation, but officials stood firm. The case was closed, the cause accidental, and no further inquiry was justified. To them, the discovery ended the story. To the families, it only marked a new chapter of unanswered questions. As years passed, the Coles names did not fade. True crime documentaries picked up the story, framing it as one of the most baffling modern disappearances with a chilling final twist. Online communities still debated late into the night, trading theories and piecing together maps of the hotel. In town, the hotel stood as a landmark both of commerce and tragedy, its walls whispered about, its history forever altered by what was found within. 8 years after their disappearance, the discovery of Daniel and Marissa Cole provided answers, but not truth. They were remembered not just as a young couple whose honeymoon ended in horror, but as symbols of a mystery that refused to rest. To this day, questions linger in every corner of that old building. Why hadn't staff noticed the sealed passage? How could two people vanish into a wall without anyone realizing? And most haunting of all, did someone deliberately make sure they never walked out?